It came from the east side of the planet, which was strange. Easterly winds on Vorith were rare. The old weather logs, the ones written by the first human survey teams, 23 years ago, said an easterly wind meant one thing. It meant the pressure walls in the upper atmosphere had broken, and when the pressure walls broke on Vorith, the storms that followed were not normal storms. Teo noticed it while he was fixing the relay antenna on the roof of the outpost. He stopped working. He stood up straight and looked at the sky. It was a pale greenish color, the way it always looked before heavy rain on this world. But there was something else. The clouds to the east were moving fast. Too fast. They were dark at the bottom and white and boiling at the top, and they were growing as he watched them, getting bigger, getting taller, eating the sky from one side. He climbed down the ladder carefully and went back inside. The outpost was small. It had 4 rooms, a main control room, a storage room, a medical bay, and a sleep room with 2 bunks. The walls were thick and gray. Everything smelled like recycled air and old coffee. There were screens on every wall showing data, atmospheric readings, seismic activity, the signal traffic coming from the Dragon Clan territories nearby. It was not a comfortable place. But Teo had been here for 3 months, and it felt like home in a way that any small, quiet place starts to feel like home after enough time. He sat down at the main console and pulled up the weather system. The number on the screen made him go still. Category 7, and rising. He had been briefed about variety storms before he left Earth. His supervisor, a dry woman named Director Huang, had shown him a video of a Category 6 hitting an empty research platform on the southern coast. When the video ended, she had looked at him calmly and said, "If you ever see a Category 6 coming, you have 4 hours. Do not waste them." He had nodded. He had thought he understood. Looking at the screen now, he understood better. He reached for the comm unit and opened a channel to the main coalition station 300 kilometers north. "Station Cora, this is Outpost 7. Do you read me?" Static. Then, breaking through, Yuri's voice, tight and clipped. "Toe. Yes, I see it too. Listen carefully. The storm is tracking directly over your position. Current projection puts the eye wall hitting you in approximately 5 hours. The signal is already degrading, so I need you to hear this now. Shelter in place. Reinforce everything. Do not go outside after hour 3. Do you understand me?" "I understand," he said. "I'm sending a retrieval team at first light tomorrow when the storm passes. Keep your emergency beacon active. If the comms go down, that beacon is how we find you." She paused. "Are you alone out there still?" "Yes. Gomo left Tuesday. It's just me." Another pause. He could hear the tension in her silence. "Okay," she said, and the word was quieter than the rest. "Stay inside. I'll see you tomorrow." Then the static took over completely, and the channel was dead. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood up and started working. He was not the kind of person who panicked. He had never been. Back on Earth, when he was training as a field medic, his instructor had told him once that the best medics were the ones who could feel fear and then set it aside like a tool they weren't using yet. Teo had always been good at that. The fear was there. He could feel it, small and cold in his chest, but it wasn't in charge. He was in charge. He spent the next 2 hours moving through the outpost with purpose. He sealed the window panels. He moved supplies to the lower storage shelves. He charged the backup power cells, checked the water reserves, pulled out the emergency medical kit, and checked everything inside it. He ate a full meal, not because he was hungry, but because he knew he might not have the chance later. He tied down anything that could fall. By the time he finished, the sky outside the one small porthole window had turned the color of a bruise. That was when the comms made one last sound. It wasn't Yuri. It was the automated atmospheric alert, a simple machine voice, flat and calm. Storm classification updated. Category 9. Recommend immediate evacuation of all non-permanent structures. Then silence. Category 9. He had no vehicle. The retrieval team was 300 kilometers away. There was no evacuation. There was only the outpost, the thick walls, and whatever came next. He checked the emergency beacon one more time. It was transmitting. Good. He sat down. He put his headphones on. He played soft music from the small audio device he carried everywhere, the same one he used in the medical bay when patients were in pain and needed something to hold on to besides their fear. The music was quiet and slow. It helped him think. That was when the outpost shook. It was not the storm. The storm was still an hour away. He could see that on the screen. This was something else. A single, heavy vibration that moved through the floor and up to the chair and into his spine. Then another. Then another. He recognized it. He had felt it twice before in his 3 months on Vorith. Dragon wings. The heavy, rhythmic beating of enormous wings, very close, shaking the ground as something large passed overhead at low altitude. He stood up slowly and looked at the external camera feed. There were 4 of them. Big ones, full-grown adult dragons, moving fast and low over the cliff face, heading south along the ridge. Their scales were dark in the green stormlight, and their wings were spread wide, fighting the rising wind. They were not flying calmly. They were flying with urgency. Something was wrong. He watched them disappear around the curve of the cliff. He didn't know what they were doing. The dragon clans of Vorith did not explain themselves to humans. The diplomatic relationship between his coalition and clans was still young and fragile, a series of careful agreements and long silences. Humans monitored. Humans stayed in their small outposts. Humans did not ask questions. He went back to his chair. The storm hit 40 minutes later. It was not like anything he had experienced before. It was not just wind and rain. It was a wall of pressure that hit the outpost like a physical thing, a fist made of atmosphere. And even inside the reinforced walls, he could feel the building groan and flex. The porthole went completely black. Not from night, but from the sheer mass of water and debris in the air. The lights flickered twice. The emergency strips on the floor came on, casting everything in a dull orange glow. He stayed at the console, watching the screens, watching the data. He was safe. The outpost was holding. He told himself this several times. And then, at some point between the second and third hour of the storm, when the wind was so loud that thinking was difficult and the whole world had become nothing but noise and orange light and the numbers climbing on the pressure monitor, he heard something that was not the storm. He took off his headphones. He listened. It was faint, barely there. The storm tried to drown it out. But it came again, and this time he placed it. Not a mechanical sound. Not a structural creak. Something alive. Small and breathing. Fast and shallow, like 2 tiny sets of bellows pumping hard against the cold. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the cliff face. He sat very still for 10 full seconds. Then he stood up, put on his heaviest coat, and walked to the door. The moment he pushed it open, the storm grabbed it like it was nothing, like the thick metal door weighed no more than a piece of paper, and slammed it back against the wall. Wind and rain hit him in the face, so hard that for a second he could not breathe. He bent forward, grabbed the door frame with both hands, and pulled himself out into the storm. He could not see more than 2 meters in front of him. The rain was not falling. It was flying, moving sideways in thick sheets, and it stung every piece of skin it touched. The ground under his boots was already running with water, small rivers forming in every crack and hollow of the cliff path. The wind made a sound like something screaming, high and long and without end. He had clipped a safety line to the doorframe before he left. He kept one hand on it as he moved. He followed the sound. It was hard to track in all that noise. He would hear it, that small, fast-breathing, 2 sets of it, slightly out of rhythm with each other, and then the wind would shift and swallow it, and he would stop and wait, standing in the storm like a wet stone, until it came back. It always came back. It was closer each time. The cliff face to the right of the outpost had a section of older rock. He knew this from his survey maps, where the stone was softer and had been carved out over centuries by water and wind into shallow caves and tunnel openings. The dragon clans used some of them. He had been told, very clearly, to stay away from that area. The sound was coming from there. He found the opening by almost walking into the pile of rocks that had fallen in front of it. Fresh rock, pale and jagged and still sharp at the edges, not worn smooth by weather. Something had come down recently, very recently. He could see where the tunnel entrance had been, a wide, dark gap in the cliff, now mostly blocked by a collapse of heavy stone. Mostly blocked, Not entirely. There was a gap at the bottom left corner. Small, maybe half a meter wide, less than that tall. Dark inside. And from that darkness, very clearly now that he was close, came the sound of breathing. Two small, frightened things breathing fast. He got down on his knees in the water and put his face close to the gap. His hand light was in his coat pocket. He pulled it out and turned it on and pushed it into the gap ahead of him. Two pairs of eyes looked back at him. He went completely still. They were small, much smaller than he had expected. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, maybe a little bigger. One had scales that caught the light and threw it back in flecks of gold. The other was darker, silver gray, with scales that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They were pressed together in the back corner of the alcove, as far from the gap as they could get, their small bodies shaking, not just from cold, from fear. Their eyes were huge, pale and luminous, catching the light like mirrors. They stared at him without moving, without making a sound. The breathing he had heard was still happening. Rapid, shallow, but they had gone silent the moment the light hit them. Frozen, waiting to see what he would do. He spoke quietly. He didn't know why. It felt like the right thing. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I see you." He pulled back from the gap and sat in the rain for a moment, thinking. He knew what these were. He had read the briefing files more carefully than most people read anything. Dragon hatchlings, newly born. He could tell from their size and the softness of their scales, which would harden over the first few months. According to everything he had read, dragon hatchlings in their first 72 hours of life needed two things above everything else: warmth and contact. Not food, not water, warmth and contact. Specifically, the warmth of a parent's body and the vibration of a parent's heartbeat. Without those two things, the hatchlings would go into a kind of shutdown, their bodies pulling all heat inward, slowing everything down, trying to survive but slowly losing the fight. He looked at the gap. He looked at the rocks blocking the tunnel. He could not move those rocks. They were each 3 times his size and packed in tight. He had no tools. He had no vehicle, no machinery, no way to call for help. The comms were dead. The storm would not stop for hours. What he had: one emergency thermal blanket, folded in the inside pocket of his coat, a medic's training, and a heartbeat. He made his decision in about 4 seconds. He pulled off his outer coat and laid it over the rocks. Then he got down flat on his stomach in the running water and pushed himself through the gap head first, pulling his arms in front of him to fit. It was tight. The rocks scraped his back and his shoulders. He moved slowly, carefully, not rushing, and came through into the alcove on his hands and knees. The hatchlings pressed themselves further into the corner. He stayed very low. He did not reach for them. He sat back against the wall opposite them and made himself as small as he could and did not move. He let them look at him. He let them decide. He talked, not to say anything important, just to fill the silence with something calm. He told them about the outpost, about the coffee that always tasted slightly wrong because the recycling filter was old, about the survey maps he had spent 3 weeks memorizing before he came here. He told them about his mother's kitchen back home, the smell of it on winter mornings, the way the light came through the one small window above the sink. He talked the way he talked to patients in the medical bay, steady and low and without any urgency in his voice, because urgency was a kind of fear, and fear was contagious, and the last thing these two needed right now was more fear. Slowly, the silver one stopped shaking. It was small. He almost missed it, but the rapid trembling in the small silver body eased, just a fraction, and the huge pale eyes blinked once. He reached into his coat, moving slowly, no sudden motions, and took out the emergency thermal blanket. It was a good one, military grade, designed to hold body heat in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human. He unfolded it carefully, the metallic surface crackling softly in the silence of the alcove. Then he did the thing that his briefing files would have called insane. He opened the blanket wide, opened his jacket beneath it, and held out his arms. He waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The gold one watched him with those huge mirror eyes, still and unreadable. The silver one had its head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand what it was seeing. Then the silver one moved. It came forward in small, careful steps, testing the ground with each foot before putting its weight down, the way a cautious creature moves when it is not sure but is more afraid of staying still than of going forward. It stopped just at the edge of his reach. He did not move. He let it come the rest of the way on its own. It pressed its small head against his chest. He wrapped the blanket around it gently. He could feel its heart beating against him, so fast, like a small machine running too hard. He reached into his other coat pocket and took out his audio device. He put one earbud in his own ear and held the other near the silver hatchling. He pressed play. Soft music came out, slow and quiet. The same song he always used. The gold one watched from the corner for another minute. Then it crossed the alcove in 3 quick steps and pushed itself against his other side, burrowing under the blanket without any hesitation, as if it had simply made up its mind and was done waiting. He wrapped the blanket around both of them. Outside, the storm screamed. The world was nothing but noise and water and dark. In the alcove, pressed against his chest, 2 hatchlings breathed. The fast, frightened rhythm of their breathing began, slowly, to change. It matched something steadier, something they could feel through the blanket, through his ribs, through everything. His heartbeat. First the silver one's breathing slowed, then the gold one's. One by one they fell asleep. Teo did not sleep. He sat with his back against the cold rock. 2 small dragons pressed against his chest, and he watched the gap in the stone wall, and he listened to the storm, and he stayed awake. He adjusted the blanket every hour. He checked their breathing. He made sure they were warm. He did not leave. He did not even think about leaving. There was no window in the alcove, no way to see the sky. But after hours of sitting still with his back against the cold rock, he noticed that the gap in the stone wall had changed. The total blackness of the storm night was becoming something slightly less dark, a deep gray, then a pale, watery gray. The kind of light that does not announce itself loudly. It simply arrives, slowly, the way all mornings arrive on worlds have been through hard nights. The storm was pulling back. It was still loud outside. The wind still moved. But the screaming edger was gone, replaced by something lower and steadier, and the rain against the cliff face had gone from a roar to a heavy drum. The worst had passed. He had made it through the night. The 2 hatchlings were still asleep. The gold one, Nara, he had started calling her in his head, because he needed to call them something, and gold made him think of warmth, had her small head resting on his left arm. Her scales rose and fell with every breath. The silver one, Bori, was curled more tightly against his right side, tucked under the edge of the blanket. His small tail wrapped once around Teo's wrist like he was holding on in his sleep. Teo looked at them for a long time. Then he heard the wings. It started as a vibration in the rock behind him. Then it became sound, low and heavy and rhythmic. The deep percussion of very large wings beating the morning air. Not one set. Many, coming from the north, from the direction of the main clan territories. And they were coming fast. The hatchlings stirred. Nara lifted her head first, her golden eyes opening slowly, blinking at the pale light coming through the gap. She made a sound, a soft, low note that he felt more than heard, somewhere in his chest. Bori uncurled and raised the silver head, and made the same sound back, slightly higher. Then they both went still and turned their heads toward the gap in the rock. They could feel it too, those wings. Teo understood what was coming. The adult dragons flying south last night, fly in a hurry, flying through a Category 9 storm, had not been flying without reason. Someone had known the hatchlings were missing. Someone had gone looking. And now, in the first light of morning, with the storm dying down, they were here. He needed to get out of this alcove. He had been thinking about this for the last 2 hours. The gap in the rockfall was the only way out. It was tight going in. It would be tight going out, especially now, with 2 small dragons pressed against him who did not want to let go. He had tested the rocks with his hands through the night, pressing against each one in the dark, feeling for any give. There was a small section near the top left of the collapse where 2 rocks were not fully settled against each other, a gap of maybe 3 fingers wide between them. 3 fingers was not enough, but it was a start. He had been working at it with his hands for the last 2 hours. Slowly, carefully, not pulling rocks away from the pile. That was how you brought everything down on top of yourself. But finding the ones that could shift without affecting the others, moving them millimeter by millimeter, creating space. His hands were cut from the sharp edges. He could feel the blood drying and cracking on his fingers every time he moved them. He did not stop. The wings were closer now, much closer. He could hear them clearly through the rock. He worked faster. Nara and Bori were fully awake now. They stayed pressed against him, but their heads were up, alert, their eyes moving between the gap in the wall and him back and forth, as if they were waiting to see what he would do, as if they had decided, somewhere in the night, that what he did was the right thing to do. That thought sat somewhere warm in his chest. The rock shifted, not a collapse. A single large stone near the top of the left side tilted inward by a few centimeters, and suddenly the gap at the bottom was wider. Not by much, but enough. Maybe enough. He looked at the hatchlings. "Okay," he said quietly. "We are going to go slowly, very slowly, and you cannot make any sudden moves, because if these rocks come down, we are all in serious trouble. Do you understand me?" They stared at him with their huge pale eyes. He took that as a yes. He moved Bori first, tucking him gently against his chest with one arm, keeping the thermal blanket around him. Then he got Nara settled on his other side. He got down onto his stomach. Both hatchlings held against him and began to push himself toward the gap. It was harder than going in. Going in. He had only his own body to worry about. Now he had two small creatures who did not understand why he was pressing them against the cold ground, and they squirmed. He stopped twice and held absolutely still and talked to them in the same low, steady voice until they calmed down. Then he kept moving. His shoulders caught on the rock. He breathed out completely, making himself as flat and thin as he could, and pushed. He came through. The morning air hit him like cold water. He got to his knees, one arm still around each hatchling, and he looked up. They were everywhere. 14 dragons stood on the cliff face and the rocks above him. Some were perched on the high ledges, looking down. Some were on the ground, 20, 30 meters away, perfectly still. They were enormous. Even the smallest of them was 3 times the length of the outpost. Their scales were dark in the pale morning light, deep greens and blacks and one the color of old iron, and their eyes were all fixed on the same point. On him, he could feel the weight of their attention, like a physical thing pressing down on his shoulders. He had been briefed about Dragon Clan elders. He had read the descriptions. Nothing in any briefing document had prepared him for what it actually felt like to be the only human in a half-kilometer radius, kneeling in the mud, surrounded by the oldest and largest creatures on this planet, all of them staring at him with expressions he could not read. The biggest one moved. It came forward fast, faster than something that size had any right to move, crossing 30 meters of cliff ground in 4 long strides, and it stopped just close enough that Teo could feel the heat coming off its body and smell the deep mineral smell of old scales and storm air. Its head came down, low, level with his chest. The eyes were the color of deep amber, ancient, unreadable, and they were not looking at his face. They were looking at the 2 small shapes pressed against his chest, at the rise and fall of small scales breathing, at the thermal blanket wrapped around 2 sleeping. No, awake now, very awake. Hatchlings were looking back at their father with wide gold and silver eyes. The big dragon made a sound, low, from deep in its chest. Not a roar, not a threat. Something Teo had no word for. He did not move. He did not run. He looked up at the enormous creature filling his entire field of vision, and he kept his arms steady around the hatchlings, and he said the only thing that came to him, "They are sleeping. Please do not wake them." The cliff went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The big dragon, Kale, though Teo did not yet know his name, stood absolutely still. His amber eyes moved from the hatchlings to the human's face, and for a long, long moment, nobody on that cliff moved at all. Kale stood with his head lowered, his amber eyes fixed on the 2 small shapes breathing against the human's chest. The other dragons on the cliff did not speak. They did not shift their weight, or spread their wings, or make any of the sounds that dragons made when they were deciding something. They were still in a way that only very old and very powerful creatures can be still. Completely, totally, like statues carved from the same rock as the cliff itself. Teo stayed on his knees in the mud. His arms were tired. His hands were cut and stiff from the cold and from hours of moving rocks in the dark. His back hurt from a night on a stone floor. But he did not put the hatchlings down, and he did not move, and he kept his breathing slow, and even because he understood, somewhere below thought, in the part of him that was purely animal and purely alive, that what happened in the next few minutes depended almost entirely on how calm he appeared to be. Then a sound came from the back of the gathered dragons. It was not loud. It was low and smooth, like a note played on an instrument with only one string, and every dragon on that cliff responded to it immediately. The ones on the high ledges turned their heads. The ones on the ground stepped back, opening a path through their ranks. Even Kale straightened slightly and turned. A dragon came forward through the gap. She was not the largest one there. She was not the most decorated or the most obviously powerful. But there was something about the way she moved that made Teo understand immediately that she was the most important. Every other dragon on the cliff was watching her the way people watch something they are afraid of losing. She moved slowly with great care, and she came to stand beside Kale, and she looked at the hatchlings, and her face did something that Teo had no word for. This was Roa. He did not know her name yet, but he knew what she was. Their mother. She looked at her children for a long time. She looked at the thermal blanket wrapped around them, at the way they were pressed against a human's chest, at the way the gold one, Nara, had her small head resting on the human's arm with her eyes half open, still slow and warm with sleep. Roa's eyes moved to the human's face. She studied him the way you study a thing you have never seen before and are not sure is real. From somewhere behind the gathered dragons, a younger dragon, Sovi, who had been a hatchling's escort the night before, began to speak. His voice was low and fast, and though Teo could not understand the language, he could hear the shape of it. An account, a story being told, the rock slide, the storm, the hatchlings pushed into the alcove, the collapse that sealed them in, the escape, the decision to fly back to the clan in the dark, and the storm, and tell the elders. When Sovi finished, the oldest dragon on the cliff, Elder Vor, with scales the color of old iron and eyes like pale fire, spoke. His voice was deep enough to feel in the ground. Teo did not understand the words, but the tone was very clear. The tone said, this should not be possible. A translated voice came from somewhere above him. He looked up. A small device had been mounted on the outpost wall, a standard diplomatic translation unit, part of the coalition monitoring equipment. He had forgotten it was there. It had been recording and translating since the dragons arrived. The translated voice was flat and mechanical, but the words came through clearly enough. Elder Vor asked how the small creature survived the storm, and why it did not leave. Teo looked up at Elder Vor. I found them in the rockfall, he said. He kept his voice plain and simple, the way he would explain something to a patient who was frightened and needed facts. They were cold and in shock. I know that hatchlings need warmth in the first days. I had a thermal blanket, and I had my body heat, so I stayed with them. A pause while the translator processed, and played it back in the dragon language, or spoke again. The translator followed. The storm was a Category 9. No soft-skin structure on this cliff was rated to survive a Category 9. The outpost should have failed. It held, Tao said simply, and if it had not held? He thought about this for 1 second. Then it would not have held, but it did. So we are here. Vor was quiet. Then he asked a question that Teo could tell had been waiting behind all the other questions, the one that was a real question. You knew what the hatchlings were? You knew what it means to our clan when hatchlings are lost. You are a soft-skin, a lesser species, an outsider on this world. Why did you not leave them and save yourself when the second collapse came? The cliff was so quiet that Teo could hear the wind moving over the high rocks above them. He looked at Nara and Bori. Nara was fully awake now, watching him with her gold eyes. Bori had his small head tilted the way he always tilted it when something was happening that he wanted to understand. Teo looked back up at Elder Vor. They were scared and cold, he said. I do not know how to leave something that is scared and cold. The translator spoke. The cliff stayed silent. Then something happened that he did not expect. Roa moved. She came forward slowly, one step at a time, her enormous body moving with a kind of careful control that looked strange on something so large, like watching a mountain decide to be gentle. She came closer and closer, and then she lowered her head until it was level with Teo's chest, and she stopped. Her head was the size of his entire upper body. He could feel the warmth coming off her scales. He could see every detail of her face, the fine lines around her eyes that came from age, the small places where old scars had changed the pattern of her scales, the way her nostrils moved slowly as she breathed. She was not looking at him. She had her eyes closed. She was listening. He understood after a moment. She was listening to his heartbeat, the same heartbeat that her children had fallen asleep against in the dark. She was hearing it for the first time. This sound had kept her children warm through the worst night on this planet in a decade. And she was very still, and her face did the thing again that he had no word for. Nara made a small sound. She reached out one small golden claw and touched Roa's face. Roa opened her eyes. She looked at the hatchling. Then she looked at Teo. The look lasted a long time. He did not look away, and he did not speak, and he did not pretend to understand what was happening in her eyes. Because he did not. He only knew that it was important and that it required him to be present and quiet and honest, and those were things he knew how to do. Then, from behind the group, the sound of a shuttle engine cut through the morning air. Every dragon head turned. The Coalition rescue shuttle came over the ridge low and fast. Yuri in the front seat with her face pressed close to the glass, already scanning. It circled once and landed on the flat rock 200 meters down the cliff, and before the engines had fully stopped, the side door was open and Yuri was moving across the rocks at a run with Doan behind her, his diplomatic pad already out. Yuri saw the dragons first. She slowed. Then she saw Teo. She stopped completely. She looked at him, kneeling in the mud, hands bleeding, coat torn. Two small dragons wrapped in a silver blanket pressed against his chest. An expression on her face moved through about 6 different things in the space of 2 seconds. Dohan reached for his incident report pad. Teo looked at both of them and shook his head once. Not yet. They listened. They stood where they were, and on the cliff above them. Surrounded by 14 dragon elders who had come expecting to mourn, Roa looked at the human kneeling in the morning mud and made a sound that the translator did not have a word for. Some things do not translate. Some things do not need to. 3 days later, Teo stood in a place no human had ever stood before. The Varadi nesting grounds were at the top of the southern cliffs, above the cloud line, where the air was thin and cold and tasted like clean stone. The ground up there was flat and wide, and the rock had been worn smooth over hundreds of years by the weight of dragons landing and taking off. At the center of the grounds there was a circle marked out in the stone itself, carved deep and filled with something that caught the light and made it warm, a resin from deep in the cliff, the color of old amber, poured into the carved lines and hardened over generations. It glowed faintly even in daylight. Teo was wearing clothes that did not belong to him. Yuri had brought them from the station. She had not explained where they came from, only handed them to him that morning with a look that said she had questions but had decided to wait. The clothes were simple, dark and well-made, nothing fancy, but they were clean and whole, which was more than could be said for what he had been wearing for the past 3 days. He had been told to stand at the edge of the carved circle. He stood there. Around him, the Dragon Clan elders had arranged themselves in a wide ring, all 14 of them. Their scales caught the morning light in different ways. Deep green, black, old iron, dark red at the edges. They were quiet, and they were still, and they were watching him with the kind of attention that made the air feel heavier. Dohan was standing 40 meters back at the edge of the grounds, near the path that led down to the lower cliff. He had his diplomatic pad in both hands, and his mouth was slightly open, and had been slightly open for most of the past 3 days. Yuri stood beside him with her arms crossed, her face calm in a way that faces are calm when the person is working very hard to keep them that way. Nobody had told Teo what was going to happen. Vor had come to the outpost the evening before with the translator unit, and had spoken for a long time. He had explained certain things about Dragon Clan tradition. He had explained the naming ceremony, what it was, what it meant, how it had been performed every generation for 600 years without change. And then he had explained the change that was going to happen today and why. And he had watched Teo's face while he explained it. Teo had listened without speaking until we're finished. Then he had asked one question. What was he supposed to do? Vor had looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Listen first. At the end, you will know." Now Roa walked to the center of the circle. She moved the way she always moved, slowly, with great care, every step placed with full attention, as if the ground deserved that respect. She carried Nara on the curve of one foreleg and Bori in the other, both hatchlings awake and bright-eyed in the clear morning air. Nara's gold scales caught the sun and threw small coins of light across the stone. Bori's silver scales were calm and still, absorbing the light the way deep water does. Roa set them down gently in the center of the carved circle. She straightened and she spoke. Her voice filled the whole space above the cliff top, low and resonant, rolling out across the stone, and the open air, and the long drop below the cliff edge where the clouds moved slowly. The translator Toa's belt rendered it quietly into his ear. She was speaking the names, the clan names, the ancient names that carried lineage and history, and the weight of every dragon that had come before them. The name she gave Nara meant something like the one who carries light forward. The name she gave Bori meant something like the one who holds the line. The elders answered together when she finished. One single sound, from 14 throats, that moved to the ground and up to the soles of Teo's boots and into his chest. Then Roa stepped back. She turned and looked at Teo. The translator spoke. "Now you." He walked forward. He crossed the carved circle and stopped in front of the two hatchlings. Nara looked up at him immediately, her gold eyes wide and warm, and she made the small, low sound she always made when she saw him, the one he felt more than heard. Bori tilted his head to the left the way he always did and watched him with those silver eyes that seemed to be thinking several things at once. Teo crouched down until he was at their level. He had not prepared anything. He had thought about it for 3 days and had not been able to prepare anything, because every time he tried to think of the right words, they felt wrong, too large or too small, or too much like something borrowed from somewhere else. So he had stopped trying to prepare and had decided to wait and see what came when the moment arrived. He looked at Nara for a long time. He thought about his grandmother. She had lived in a small house at the edge of a village, and in the evening she used to sit outside and watch the sky change color, and she had a name for the last light before dark, a word in her own language that had no good translation, a word that meant the brightness that stays after the source is gone. She had tried to teach it to him when he was small. He had been a poor student, but he remembered the word. He said it now, quietly, just a Nara. Nara blinked. She leaned forward and pressed the top of her small golden head against his palm. He looked at Bori. He thought about his mother. She had grown up in a house with no yard, in a city that was always loud, and she had loved the stars the way people love things they cannot have enough of. When he was young and could not sleep, she would take him to the roof of their building and point out the stars above the light pollution, the ones bright enough to push through, and she had a name for them too. Not a scientific name. Her own name for them. A word that meant the ones who came all the way home. He said that word now, just to Bori. Bori made a sound that was not quite the same as the sound Nara made, but came from the same place, and he stepped forward and pushed a small silver head under Teo's other hand. Teo stayed crouched between them with one hand on each small head and said nothing else for a moment. The carved circle glowed around them. The elders were completely still. Then he stood up. He turned to walk back to the edge of the circle, and Kale was standing directly in his path. The big dragon had not moved during the ceremony. He had stood at the far side of the ring with his amber eyes fixed on the circle, and Teo had not looked at him directly since the morning on the cliff. Now there was no avoiding it. He stopped and looked up at Kale's face. Kale looked back at him. Then, with a slowness and care that was remarkable for something so large, Kale reached out one enormous claw and placed it on Teo's shoulder. Gently, with complete control, the tips of the claw pressed into the fabric of the jacket. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to mark. A deliberate pressure, a deliberate choice. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he lifted it away, on the shoulder of the jacket, for clean lines pressed into the fabric, the Verratti mark of kinship. Teo had read about it once, in a footnote in a diplomatic file. It was not given often. It was not given lightly. It meant, this one is known to us. This one is not outside. Kale stepped aside. Teo walked back to Yuri and Dohan. Yuri looked at the mark on his jacket. She opened her mouth. "Don't," he said quietly. "Not yet." He got into the shuttle. He sat down and put his earbuds in and pressed play on his audio device, and the slow, soft song came through. The same one he had played in the dark for two small creatures who had needed something steady to hold on to. He looked out the window as the shuttle lifted off the cliff top. Far below, in the carved circle that glowed amber in the morning light, two small shapes were watching the shuttle rise. One gold, one silver. They grew smaller as the shuttle climbed, but they did not move. They stayed in the circle, and they watched until the clouds came between them, and the shuttle and the cliff and the whole of Vor fell away behind the white. He played the song. They had learned the rhythm. They would never forget it.